Olá, boa noite.
Hello, good evening, dear students. Welcome to our second evening in this amazing event called Global Meet. I'm Professor Caroline and I will be tonight with you guys mediating this amazing round of conversation we're going to have. Today we're going to talk a little bit about the education of the originary people of Brazil. So I would like to thank you all that are watching and that are willing to discuss this important topic with us. I would also like to thank all of our friends from Uninter that made this event possible, our deans, the studio guys, the translators, the interpreters, the marketing, everyone that is involved in this amazing event. Before introducing our speakers who will bring all their insights tonight, I'm going to tell you a little about how the dynamic is going to work tonight. So the first thing, send your questions through our chat. And while the talks are going on, you can write down because I'm going to be here with the guys from marketing looking at that and select a question. So at the end of their conversation, we can ask your questions to them. The second notice is that this table will have two languages. So we are going to have moments in Portuguese and moments in English. If you want to listen to the transmission in Portuguese, stay connected on the YouTube channel of Uninter. And for those who want to watch to this conversation in English, the transmission is through the Global Hub YouTube. So, in 2015, UN proposed the member countries to have a new agenda of sustainable development called the 2030 Agenda that has the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And this is a joint effort of countries, companies, institutions, and the civil society. And these SDGs want to ensure human rights and poverty, fight inequality and injustice, reach the gender equality and the empowerment of women, girls, acting against climate changes, as well as facing the other large challenges of our times. The topic of this evening will be quality education. And we are going to emphasize the originary peoples of Brazil. In order to debate this huge topic, we have the presence of two very special guests, Professor Aidan Singerman and Professor Tiana Becker. Our conversation will have three different moments. We are going to start with Professor Adam, that will speak English, and then we are going to have Professor Diana in Portuguese, and then we are going to have a third moment for Q&A at the end. And that part will be in Portuguese too. So please send your questions in English or in Portuguese because we can translate them for you, no problems. So I would just swap into English to introduce our guest.
Aiden, so thank you very much for being here with us.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to have you here. And for sure, going to be a great moment for our students and everyone that is watching us right now. So, Aiden, before I just give you the word, I'm going to just tell to the students a little bit about you. If I make some mistakes, please just correct me. But let's see. So Aiden was born in the U.S., United States of America, and has this Brazilian inside of him. So he has the bachelor. He made a bachelor in Harvard College and a master's and PhD also in University of Chicago. And his doctoral research were supported by the National Science Foundation of the Endangered Language Fund and Outcome Museum. So since September of 2020, Aiden has been a fellow at the Document and Engaged Students Program and National Endowment in Humanities of the U.S. federal government. Since July of the same year, 2020, he has been Associated Director for Linguistics for the Botim and Museu Paraense, Emílio Goldin, and Human Science. Adam has defended his doctoral thesis entitled the Adam, now you maybe could help me.
Morphosyntax.
Morphosyntax of Tupari, language of Brazilian Amazon. So there is the Brazilian heart, right? And has also won award after this research. So Aidan, thank you very much for being here with us today. For sure, it's a really, really great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
So I have let's start with questions. I have one first question for you. So for your dissertation, you were at Rondônia, right? Studying the Tupari. Could you tell us your impressions? How was the experience of living and learning with the Brazilian indigenous community?
Sure, I would love to answer that. First, I'd like to show a map so that everyone can have an idea of where the Tupari live. So this is the state of Rondônia. Brazilian students will be familiar more or less with the region. So Mato Grosso to the immediate east, Acre to the west, and the state of Amazonas to the north. And south of Rondônia, crossing the river, you get to Bolivia. So the Tupari live on the two indigenous reserves that I've highlighted in red on this map. So I spend all of my time at the Eastern Reserve, labeled A or A. This is the Rio Branco indigenous territory, the Terra Indígena Rio Branco. That's where I have done all of my research to date. There is also a smaller population of ethnic Tupari who live on the other reserve, the Terra Indígena Guaporé. Both of the reserves are multi-ethnic. So the Tupari do not live alone. They live with and other indigenous peoples. My own research has concentrated so far only on the Rio Branco because that's where the language, the Tupari language, continues to be spoken on a day-to-day basis. So my understanding from my colleagues who have spent time at the other indigenous reserve at the Terra Indígena Guaporé, and also my understanding from residents of that reserve who I've had the chance to meet over the years, is that the Tupari language is not really spoken on the Guaporé anymore. It's only spoken on the Rio Branco. And because I'm a linguist, and because the focus of my research is on accurately describing and documenting the Tupari language, I have spent my time where there are more speakers, which is to say on the Rio Branco. To give you an idea of what the Rio Branco looks like, this is a photo I took some time ago from at the edge of the river in the village of Serrinha. You might notice that some of the boats, at least this one here, says Educação Escolar Indígena on it, indigenous schooling, because students come via the boat from other villages up and down the river to attend school in the village of Serrinha. So those are the two images I wanted to show at first. And now I can answer Carol's question, Professora Carol's question. So I believe the question was, what were my impressions like living with the Tupari and what my experiences have been? I feel very fortunate in that everyone has treated me warmly and has welcomed me into the community. I started to work with the Tupari in August of 2013, and now it's February of 2023, so it's been almost 10 years. I feel very lucky because the Tupari have really welcomed me into their homes and to their community in a way that I really just can't, I don't have the words to express the degree of my gratitude to all of them. When I started to work on the reserve in 2013, there was no internet access anywhere on the reserve and no cell phone reception either, and rather limited electricity. The world has changed a lot in the last 10 years. Everyone on the Rio Branco, or almost everyone, now has a cell phone. quite a few villages have internet access, and this has made it easier for me, both when I'm there with the Tupari to maintain contact with my family in the US, and also when I'm not with the Tupari, I can talk to them all the time over WhatsApp and Instagram. So my experience living with the Tupari has been overwhelmingly positive, and it's difficult for me to imagine where my life would be today if I hadn't started to work with them in 2013.
Oh, that was really impressive. Aidan, thanks so much for sharing that with us. I was just, I don't know if the students know, but I lived in Canada, and I was just in one pipe ceremony this afternoon, and was so beautiful. And I can imagine you living there with them for so long and trying to get the culture. So I imagine that experience was really beautiful for sure. So I have another question to you. So, well, before I do that, I just have to let you know that we have now more than 1,000 people watching us. So thank you very much, everyone. We have people around all over Brazil. People are putting there on the chat where they are from and sending them hello to you. So, and I'm quite sure, that we do have some students from Rondônia that are watching us. Just let us know in the on the chat so we can let Adam know that he's there in some ways, right? So my second question to you is, the idea of this event is to talk about sustainable development goals, especially the fourth one, so quality education. From your experience, could you tell us how the learning process of the Tupari language is going at the Amazon?
So I should give a little bit more background. I'll try and be brief. The Rio Branco Reserve is multi-ethnic and also linguistically complex. Most of the other ethnic groups on the reserve, so the Macorap, the Aricapu, the Canoe, the Aruá, and some others, have by and large shifted to Portuguese. So they've adopted Portuguese as their day-to-day language. And among the Tupari, I should say that there are people from the Macorap and Aricapu ethnic groups who've married into the Tupari and have learned Tupari as well. Among the Tupari, whether you hear Portuguese being spoken or Tupari being spoken on a day-to-day basis really depends on what village you're in and also what household you're in the village. Some families have chosen to teach their children Tupari. Some families have chosen to teach their children Portuguese. There are also families where the parents are trying to teach their children Tupari and the children are choosing or preferring to respond in Portuguese rather than Tupari. So linguistically, it's a complex place. There are, especially now that people have access to the internet, and, you know, Rede Globo is there and YouTube is there, there's more prestige than before for Portuguese because Portuguese is accessible online in a way that Tupari really isn't. It's also the case that when health workers or education workers or teachers come from the city to the reserve, they're speaking in Portuguese, not in Tupari. And so there's an understanding, I think, not just on the Rio Branco, but that on so many other indigenous lands or indigenous reserves in Brazil, there's an understanding that Portuguese is the national language, Portuguese is the language of social advancement, Portuguese is the language of educational attainment, it's also the language of citizenship more broadly. To interact with public services in Brazil, to interact with the government, you have to know Portuguese. So there's a lot of pressure, social pressure, societal pressure, economic pressure on indigenous people, not just the Tupari, but indigenous peoples overall in the Amazon basin, to leave their native languages and to switch full-time to Portuguese. There's a counter pressure. There's a pressure in the other direction, which is that while of course there will always be some indigenous people who want to essentially become brancos, who want to turn into non-indigenous people, there's also a cultural resistance movement that wants to maintain indigeneity and doesn't see a contradiction in being Brazilian and being indigenous. So I give you all of this information as background because the question of what is learning the Tupati language like depends on a lot of factors. It depends on what language the parents in a particular family are choosing to teach to their children. It depends upon what language the children are using to communicate amongst one another. So there are villages where all of the children, every last child, speaks Tupati. And in those villages, it's much more common, in my experience, to hear children talking and playing in Tupati. In villages where there are some kids who speak Tupati and some kids who speak only Portuguese, sometimes the children just decide to all use Portuguese because it facilitates communication. Within the schools on the Rio Branco, I should say that there's a very dedicated group of indigenous teachers. Quite a few of them have graduated from the undergraduate, which is to say graduação program in intercultural education at the Federal University of Rondônia in Ji-Paraná, which is, I'm going to show this on the map one more time. So Ji-Paraná is north and slightly east of where the Rio Branco is. And that's the closest public university that offers an intercultural education program. It's much, much closer than Porto Velho, which could take you 12 hours to get there. So my answer to the question is that learning the Tupati language today is a complicated thing because you have all the possible combinations. You have children who didn't grow up speaking or hearing Tupati, but are now going to a school where the teachers are mostly Tupati and where the other students are mostly Tupati. There are also kids in the opposite situation who grew up speaking the language at home, but if they're now living in the city, then they only have access to Portuguese language education. In general, the non-indigenous teachers that come to teach in the schools on the Rio Branco do not speak Tupati. They speak Portuguese. And so they bring a particular variety of Portuguese, which is non-indigenous Portuguese, from the city onto the reserve. I should also just say one other thing, which is that the variety of Portuguese that you hear on the street in Rondônia, like in the cities, spoken by non-indigenous people, in my experience as a non-native learner of Brazilian Portuguese, to my ear, Rondônia Portuguese is quite different from the standard variety that I learned in Rio and Sao Paulo. So there's a lot, linguistically, it's a very complex place. I guess the answer to my question is it's very complicated.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, a lot of people are asking so many questions in the chat. I hope we have time to get back to that. We only have unfortunately, we have 4 minutes. So
you choose which question is most important. I'm sorry for talking.
Exactly. No, don't worry. It was really important for us to hear all your experience. I'm gonna jump I choose one question here, and I'm gonna jump for it. I hope I'm not putting you on a bad position there, but I really would like to listen. So after going through all your dissertation process, your Amazon experience, and speaking Portuguese, and students are asking actually if you speak Portuguese and Tupati. So,
I do.
Okay, perfect. So now we have one answer already. So after going through all this process, what is your wish for the Amazon people? So what expectations do you have for future public policy for the Brazilian originary people?
I was in Rondônia during the fall elections, the elections in Brazil. I think that my truest hope is that deforestation is stopped, because the existential risk to the indigenous peoples is very high. If the forest is continually destroyed, it's only a matter of time before more illegal lumber operations and illegal mining operations enter indigenous territories. I'm sure many of you have been seeing the terrible news about what's been happening to the Yanomami in northern Brazil. The Tupati are not facing a situation quite like that one, because the Tupati are more integrated into Brazilian society. But the risks are high. If deforestation continues, it's only a matter of time before protection of indigenous reserves becomes more difficult and more dangerous. So my truest hope is that with the new government in Brasília, that the commitment to stopping illegal deforestation is honored. And we've seen good signs in this direction. Certainly the new presidency in the new government in Brasília is moving in the direction of more recognition rather than less recognition for the rights of indigenous and original peoples. And so my hope is that the rights of indigenous Brazilians and both as Brazilians, as citizens of the Republic, but also as indigenous peoples, I hope that their rights are completely respected moving forward.
Thank you very much, Aiden. Was brilliant. I'm so sorry about my English. I get a little nervous.
No, it's great. Don't worry about it.
It's always a work in progress, right? You know a lot about language, and you know that.
My Portuguese is a constant work in progress, so.
So thank you very much, and
thank you.
So I'm gonna ask for excuse now. I'm gonna change for Portuguese again, and so gente, daqui a pouco a gente volta para.
So guys, we will be back to the Q&A at the end. I'm following the chat, all your questions, so please continue writing. But now we have another very, very important moment. We have now a Brazilian talking to us, Brazilian and professor of Uninter. It's Professor Tiana. Thank you so much for agreeing to be with us this evening in this challenge, which is talking about education for the originary people of Brazil. I will start by doing the same thing. I'm going to tell you a little about Professor Tiana and her resume before I go to the questions. So, Professor Tiana is a doctoral student at the program of postgraduation in technology and society of the Technological Federal University of Paraná, and a master in education and new technologies by Uninter. She has education in languages, pedagogy, and nutrition with a specialization in psychopedagogy, neurolearning, controlling and finances, gender diversity at school, distance education with emphasis in tutor education, MBA in business management for food and sanitary surveillance. She is a professor in the International University Center of Uninter in the area of education. She's a member of the research group called Between EAD, the presential, the on-site, and the hybrid education, several scenarios for teaching, resume, and learning in public policies. And she also works with interculturality in education, member of the editor board of the Dialectic and Reality and Publishing Company. A great resume, and now I say good evening for you. Hello, everyone. Hello, Carol, Professor Adam, and everyone watching us. It's a pleasure to be here. I really hope I can share a little bit, as Professor Adam, that brought us so many interesting insights. Let's talk about this important and so current, up-to-date information. This is topic. I will thank you again. We have over 1,300 people watching us, so thank you guys. And I'm keeping an eye on the chat, so send your questions. And my first question for Professor Tiana is, you have an article that you published very recently about the hybridization of the intercultural multiculturalism of the studies of the indigenous culture. How can you connect that to human rights? Very good question, Carol. This article, I invite you all to read it. It is at Sala 8 magazine, and it's available for free for everyone. So this is a freshly published article. It was published the end of last year. And so to talk a little about this intercultural multiculturalism and the hybridization of this concept, I'm going to cut out this concept so we can understand what all of this means. So what is a human right? To start off, human right is the basic rights that are inherent to all humans or all subjects, if they are civil or political or economical or cultural rights. It is what supports a dignifying life of a human. Very well, and then we start thinking about that, and culture is a human right, and we know that we live in a plurality. Brazil is a plural, diverse country, and it is impossible and incoherent to think that there is a prevalence or a monoculture in Brazil. Our culture is not a single culture, it's not singular, and it has to be valued, and the differences must be valued. Based on that, each one of us bring our own identity from this culture, our perceptions, the way we think, our beliefs, the relationships we define with others. It all comes from our cultural process, from where we come, from our cradle. And facing all that, how do we relate as humans with each other? We can't live alone, even though there is that person that says, I don't need anyone. Yeah, at some point you are going to have to communicate, interact, exchange information with someone. And so based on that, we define multiculturalism. And I bring a nice idea that Paulo Freire brought to illustrate this concept. Paulo Freire tells us that multiculturalism are cultures that do not overlap and do not juxtapose. They allow us to act, or we can expose in a freeing way, being different without being afraid of being different. And that makes us human, unique, valuing our own identity. And this is a human right. So this is the correlation. Complementing all that and knowing that multiculturalism can be understood as several cultures that coexist in peace, and that's what we want, it not necessarily exchange. They don't necessarily exchange anything. Interculturality is presented there. It is the exchange of the culturality in the multiculturalism. So when I associate the idea of multiculturalism, which is the presence of several cultures bringing interculturality, that is, the relation between them to form maybe a new culture, a new perception, or a new perspective of the world, I have hybridization, which is the connection between these two concepts that you can bring to education, to our, in our pedagogical practices, to take away the stereotypes and the labels that confuse us and don't allow us to see the reality or the need for disseminating the culture and the understanding of other people. This is a human right, right to education, culture, living with dignity and citizenship. Professor, just to let you know that on the chat, everybody knows you and they are just greeting you and saying hello. Yes, we are always interacting and it's so good. It's exchange. The love that comes from these students is priceless. Professor, on the first part of our conversation, Adam mentioned his experience with the indigenous people of Amazon and how the education happens when you think about this context. But now I would like to ask you, on the flip side, when we think of our own school experience, and us, I mean the non-indigenous people, we remember some moments like the Day of the Indigenous Person. So in basic education in Brazil, do children learn about the originary people of Brazil? How does it work here in Brazil? Oh, wow. This is a question that is kind of painful for us because hearing about a topic doesn't mean learning about it. So it's very important to have some questions here. For example, we have to teach the culture and the history of the African and the indigenous cultures in public and private institutions in Brazil. This is imposed and is defined by law. But as I said, this demand is not always met because we have a matter there, which is teacher education. We have stereotypes that are very strong, many untrue news, people that label the indigenous person as a savage, or the one that lives in the woods, in the forest, that is uncivil, or when they think about black people, they only think about slavery, and they bring concepts like the discovery of Brazil. We are still talking about Brazil being discovered, and in didactic books, we still see that. And while we have that, my belief is that, and maybe you have the same idea, but while we have these labels present in our society, while we don't drop all those stereotypes, we will not be able to really learn. So the first thing we have to consider is the education for teachers. My teacher that is going to a classroom to start a discussion about history, about the Black movement, the indigenous movements that are existing, and they want to claim their rights. What is their purpose? Why the territory definition? If I don't understand that, I can't transmit that, and the learning will not really exist. So even though there is a law, we are still taking very small steps. And I always say that when I teach, because even though there are small steps, there are steps anyway. So it's better having small steps than not having anything. So we have this law. We have, since the Constitution of 88, we have LDB, we have DCNs, we have ABNCCs, we have the law 10,699 and others that bring us that this topic must be inserted in basic education, as well as educational, early childhood education, the elementary and high schools to universities. And it is necessary because this is going to build our citizen that is more human, that has a critical outlook, a humanized outlook. There is no point in filling my student with content. And where is the other side? Where is the human side of all that? How am I going to put all that content with the society? How can I understand the other without knowing about their culture? So this is what is so important about, and that's what we have to bring to the classrooms, taking us out our, assumptions, and understanding that sometimes for you to understand the indigenous culture and the African and Afro-Brazilian cultures, you don't have to think with reason, you have to think with your heart too. You have to bring your emotion, because sometimes, for example, in the indigenous culture, they have a lot of mythology. And mythology is supported with the beliefs, the organization, the structure of a culture, and not necessarily what they tell will make sense for you. But it doesn't mean you are not going to respect what the others telling you or their beliefs. And then we go back to the first question, which is bringing multiculturalism and the hybridization inside the classrooms, so we can bring different perspectives, different points of view. So this is really something that makes a difference in the lives and the education of those students. Professor, once again, we have so many questions on the chat. And I have a question that brings what the students are commenting, and everyone watching us are writing on the chat, and something we discussed during Professor Adams' presentation. So when we think about public policies for education, could you tell us what the Brazilian law defines for the education of indigenous communities? So, for example, the indigenous child in Brazil, they have to be taught in Portuguese? Are there schools in their communities, or they have to leave their communities to go to classes? So how does it work? So remember the small steps I mentioned before, and that's it. Well, it's a small step, really, really small step, because there is a progress, but we still have niches. We have some requirements that are still lacking. Just one comment, and I'm going to bring you some numbers that I took notes that are very interesting for us to answer that. So we have the National Plan of Indigenous Education. For years it's been discussed, and so the PNA, this plan of indigenous education, is like the ABCC. Everyone knows the ABNCC is the Brazilian standard of education, and the PNA is similar. It's the first document that was made by indigenous. The ones developing the document were indigenous people that started from their communities and then had congresses and gatherings. And at the end, I mean, in the last meetings, they set 25 goals to be met for education, for the school indigenous education. But this is stopped in the Congress since 2019. So, you know, our small steps that because we have the progress, we have a document, we have a suggestion for our problem, but we need this government support. We need public policies more that are more specific and that can support all that. So thinking about the indigenous school education, since the Constitution of 88, it always specified the education, and current documents say the same, that the indigenous school education must be specific, it must be different, it doesn't have to be exactly the same as the traditional one, it has to be intercultural, and that it can be bilingual or multilingual. And the first language that must be taught to the kids must be their mother language, the language they speak in their communities. And then I bring some numbers. In the 2020 census, school census for basic education, we have 273,928 enrollments in the schools that provide indigenous education in Brazil, most of it for elementary school with 66,543 enrollments. For high school, 26,358 people enrolled. And then we take the panorama of the 15-20 years where basic education became universal. There used to be, well, there was an advance, of course, small steps, but more specifically where in the early stages, in the early grades, after the fifth year, there is a bottleneck in the communities because they don't offer, because of the structure, because of the education of the teachers that are available there, it is very difficult to provide education for higher grades. And then, yes, there is a migration. Now, the teenagers, the preteens, they start leaving their communities when they want to continue studying, looking for schools that are in the surrounding areas. And then we have a huge problem too. The culture is different, and it doesn't always accept. There is prejudice, there is a judgment of their cultures and beliefs. Often the indigenous students don't have the money to leave their community and their village and, commute, take a boat, cross a river to get to the closest school, and that ends up causing them to give up. So if it's difficult for them in the beginning, imagine for university education. With some numbers still from the census of 2020, we have 3,359 indigenous schools in Brazil. 1/3 of them are in the region of the state of Amazonas. We have 20,373 teachers, and from them, from the 3,000 schools, 334 are inside indigenous lands, landings, or communities, or quilombola communities that receive the students too. But then there's a precarization because look at that, 49% of those schools have no basic sanitation. 30% of them don't have electricity. 75% don't know what internet is. Labs to access technology, science, there's nothing. And so how are we going to meet the 2030 agenda of quality education, the SDG 4? It is a problem. It is a real problem. It's something that we have to consider, infrastructure problems that need our support. And to conclude all that, so I don't take that much time of our Q&A, there is another very important problem, which is when you go back to the languages. Inside, the workbooks should be in their mother languages, but look at the plurality, the diversity of the indigenous people that we have. Who will provide workbook for all these people with different dialects, with varied cultures? And so how can you teach the traditional knowledge that the law says they should be supported and that should exist inside the education? And the indigenous education should follow their tradition, their habits inside their community. So it's all very complicated. So other important figures from the schools I mentioned, 3,359, only 137 of them teach only their mother languages, 879 only Portuguese, 2,343 teach both. But they teach both because we are trying to invest in teacher education. And one more thing, the teachers must be educated and by people inside the communities in their intercultural licenses, because these teachers know the community, they know the issues, they know their traditions, and then they can provide the traditional knowledge that the law talks about and defines as a requirement for the indigenous education. Professor, our time is up. We are going to talk about other things in our Q&A with the questions that came from our chat. So I really thank you because it was very good to listen to you. The numbers really bring more content, more context. So the two conversations, the two talks together, they really bring an overview that there are so many things we have to take into consideration. And what we want you to understand is that we have to learn and have a critical vision of all that. I'm keeping up with the chat and I'm going to ask our students, please don't stay on the I heard about one community, and because Brazil is very diverse. So the reality of one community doesn't mean it is the same for all communities. That's what we want to reflect about. So let's go to the questions in our chat, and I'm going to start with a question about language. Professor Tiana concluded her talk about that, so let me talk about that. Starting with Aiden, and then I'm going to ask you, Tiana, to comment a little bit about it. So many students during our conversation started wonder about the future of the languages. I have questions about of Shalom, of Gabriele, of Marisangela. All of those questions are pretty much inside the same scope. So I'm going to read the question by Ticiane Santos because she brings it all together. So she asks that, what is the future of the traditional indigenous language in this context of socioeconomic pressure in the region? What place in Brazil, in the state, in the local community, that culture will have a future? Professor Adam, first. Yes, we can. So it's a difficult question. I hope all originary people of Brazil have a future of a prosperity. I want indigenous languages to continue being spoken, which means in practice that they will continue being taught to the next generations, so the next generations in the future can teach their languages to the future and future generations. I think what we see, and the question really touches on the pressure, the social, economical, and political pressure. And of course, there is the same pressure in my country and in Canada. I'm not judging Brazil because we face the same challenges in North and in South Americas. The originary peoples from Brazil, because they have their rights guaranteed by the Constitution, we see there is a certain conflict between who has the right of identifying as indigenous. And one thing I saw often in the south of Rondônia is that if someone who belongs to a people that left their original language and started speaking only Portuguese, and if that person asks the name of a bird or a tree in your language, the indigenous people told me that they went through this situation and they feel like ashamed or humiliated because they are not able to show their linguistic knowledge because they learned only Portuguese. So many friends of mine from the Tupari people, the only people in the indigenous land of Rio Branco that still use their mother languages on their day by day, many people from the ethnicity told me, I don't want my son to feel this kind of shame. I want my son, my daughter to know Portuguese, to communicate with non-indigenous people or indigenous from other ethnicities, but if they are challenged and if the non-indigenous tell them you are not a real indigenous because you don't speak your people's language, they don't want this to happen to their kids. So there is a social, economical, and political pressure that incentivizes the abandonment of their mother languages in place of the Portuguese. But there's the other way too, for the indigenous people to be recognized by society as an originary people. The language is an important tool for achieving that goal. So that would be my answer. Despite all the pressure, the socioeconomic pressure that goes against the future of the indigenous languages, there is also resistance. Like, I want to continue being recognized by society as a real indigenous person. I want my kids to be real indigenous people. So I'm going to teach them my language so our mother language isn't forgotten. Thank you, Professor. And now I want Professor Tiana, but just a comment, because people are complimenting your Portuguese. Now they are listening to you speaking Portuguese and they are all very impressed. So now, Professor Tiana, I think Professor Adam said everything. I'm very optimistic, you know, I don't like thinking of things, even though they don't look good, I want to think of the small steps. So while there is one indigenous person, while there is resistance, while there is this ancestrality, the orality, the habits, and while as subjects, as individuals, they understand what they have as human rights, I believe that's not going to die out. I believe it's going to be a way to face capitalism and the matters of economical power that impose so many things, but we'll always be there. I believe in education, transformative, as Paulo Freire says, we transform people that will transform the world. So we are here exactly to talk about education, of disclosing and talking about this knowledge, about this history. It's us. We can do that. The originary people originated us. We came from there. I can say, oh, I'm European. But if you didn't come directly, at some point in your family tree, you have a mix, you have a contact, you are part of these originary people, the indigenous or the African people. And this is our history, and it's what we value. And because of that, I believe, while there are movements and there are fights and there is this condition to see culture as something transformative like education, we are not going to surrender to the pressures of capitalism and the economical pressures in general. That's what I hope, at least. We have so many good questions, and we only have 4 minutes. So I will have to choose, and I'm going to choose one for both of you, but it's something that came from different people, and it's something I really want to read. And I'm going to choose the one by Clara Fragoso. She says, what do you think could be done by the government to help? I know it's a difficult question, but bear with me. The challenge is, what do you think could be done by the government to help the Brazilian originary people that you haven't seen done yet? Do you think there is a possibility of public policies that could help preserve the language and the culture? The challenge is now to you. Let's start with Adam or Tiana now. You choose. So, okay. Now on the crossfire, let's see how we can deal with that. So anyway, public policies and affirmative action policies are usually temporary. They may become for really changing the scenario and raise awareness for the people, for the population, that there is a problem to be solved. I would say that the investment on education, the national plan of indigenous school education, and valuing that, and I will always tend to education because, you know, it's what I do, and it's what I really believe on change through education. So I think policies that will reaffirm and improve that plan and bring them to visibility, put them in practice and allow them to really be experienced inside the communities, inside the schools that provide indigenous education. I think this is something that we have not seen before because it is still in process, but that may be a very good path for us to advance in education, culture, and modifications that need a more careful look to improve. Your turn, Professor Adam. I agree 100% with what Professor Tiana said. I just want to add something that, and what I'm going to say is, of course, it can apply in my country. It's not just for Brazil. Society needs, the whole society needs a change in terms of how indigenous topics are addressed, because somehow someone can say, oh, there's no more indigenous people, or there is something like, for you to be a real indigenous in the 21st century, you have to live in the woods, you have to hunt, you can't eat rice and beans or something like that. So we need a new version that accepts the reality, and the reality is that indigenous peoples are many and they are diverse. And so I think that would be the point I would like to add. Any public policies that don't consider the diversity of the originary Brazilian people will not work, because these peoples are not different randomly. They're deep differences, and they all should be recognized as separate ethnicities. Well, we have so many questions on our chat, but unfortunately, we have to continue with our agenda, and I'm sure you both were a good combination of talks. We have to organize more moments like that, because students are really going to enjoy a lot and learn a lot. And every time I will think about other ways to put you two together. So now I would like you to just say goodbye and say a word of incentive to our students before our cultural moment. Don't forget, we still have that cultural moment. So Professor Adam would like to say goodbye. Yes, thank you all for your virtual presence. I thank a lot for the opportunity of talking about this experience I had in Rondônia, and I really hope you continue learning a lot, because only by learning we can improve our world. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Adam. Now, Professor Tiana. So quick, so little time, and we want to stay here and talk more about it, but we hope we have other opportunities. Also, I would like to thank you all that participated so much on the chat, because without them we wouldn't be here. Without them there would be no debate, no reflection, no new thinking. So I believe the majority will disconnect from this transmission with questionings, with some things that will make them reflect on education, on valorization, on prejudices, and let's take all the labels away and see people as human beings, as collective beings. So let's make a better world, but really make and not just talk about it. At Uninter, we have ethnico-racial education, which is mandatory for a license and bachelor certificates, and we're going to have Tiana and Gisley and other professors, and every time it's possible, go and say hello to us, send your questions, because we are here available to help and improve the world. Greetings to all of you and good night. Thank you, and to everyone that participated too. Thank you, Professor Tiana. And as important as our conversations, we have our cultural moment. And to present this cultural moment of the evening, I'll call forth Professor Flor. Hello, everyone. Thank you for the invitation, Caroline. So I'm Professora Flor Pimentel of the Cultural and Corporal Languages course, and I'm here after such a significant moment of learning. So now it's time for us to go to our cultural moment. And what I bring to you at the Global Meet are some productions made by our students, so you can see how they produce art and culture. And today we have a student that is I always bring some songs from him. He is a composer, and this is a brand new from Zeus Sullivan. He's a music student, and he wrote, about day by day that you struggle, you work hard, you wake up early, and sometimes we lose our pace, but he says that it's worth it. The faith, the struggle, because that's the only way we can leave a legacy. So let's listen to
trazendo a minha identidade pra poder provar que eu sou o mesmo de alguns anos atrás, com aprendizados a mais, sei que não posso desistir jamais. Pensei em tudo que eu queria fazer, mesmo com a vida me espancando eu não deixei de crer, pois sei que tudo é questão de fé. Trabalho duro e peço a Deus pra me manter de pé. Da perfeição ainda tô longe, eu sei, mas pra ser bom eu fiz de tudo, eu me esforcei. Se reconhece o meu corre, eu digo amém, pois tem responsa e humildade pra quem tem. Dedico essa a todo aquele que, assim como eu, vive no mundo perdido, mas nunca se perdeu. Nobres guerreiros de bom coração, que vencem guerras com a guita e com o mic na mão. Então vai, mostre a eles que o medo não existe pra nós. Estamos na linha de frente, ideia firme na mente. Eles tiram tudo, mas não tiram a nossa voz. Então vai, não perca tempo, talvez nem tenha o amanhã pra nós. Faça o que pode fazer e deixe o seu legado. Mais importante que ser visto é ser sempre lembrado. Trago na pele os cortes do que um dia me feriu. Trago nas letras as histórias que você não viu. Me ver sorrindo é muito bom, é fácil, mas tu nem sabe dos trampos que enfrento lá no meu quarto. Então, melhor parar por aqui. A minha missão é encorajar e não te deprimir, né? Contar a história toda agora é desnecessário, até porque ainda tem muito som pra ser lançado. E não desista dos sonhos, independente dos contras. Corra atrás de tudo aquilo que motiva você. A vida passa voando, quase impossível de ver. Se o amanhã não chegar, o que tu vai fazer? Então vai, mostre a eles que o medo não existe pra nós. Estamos na linha de frente, ideia firme na mente. Nos tiram tanto, mas não tiram a nossa voz. Então vai, não perca tempo, talvez nem tenha um amanhã pra nós. Faça o que pode fazer e deixe o seu legado. Mais importante que ser visto é ser sempre lembrado. Não se prive a esse medo de viver. Sintonize os seus sonhos com a vontade de aprender. Você já tem o seu caminho e tem a direção. O legado da sua vida tá em suas mãos. Tudo aquilo que um dia te feriu é tão pequeno comparado ao que você ainda não viu, pois esse mundo é totalmente pra você. A hora é essa, vai em frente e faça valer.
Que legal. Quem quiser conhecer um pouquinho
And
mais
if you want to know more about our students' work, his YouTube channel is Seu Sullivan. It has many songs that he wrote. And Professor Flor is back tomorrow. We have more global meeting tomorrow, right, Caroline? And we're going to have another cultural moment with productions from our students. See you all, and thank you for the participation. Thank you all that watched us. I would like to thank our speakers and everyone. And to conclude, as we always do, I wish you all good studies, and we have more tomorrow. See you. Bye-bye.